Okay, Boker Tov, everybody. We're in the third section of our study of the Amida. We're basically up to what is the last beracha of the Amida. That's the beracha of Sim Shalom. This is the last blessing that concludes the Amida, and then afterwards there's a little epilogue, so to speak, to the Amida, what the rabbis call Tahanunim, which we'll also take a look at, and that leads us into the post-Amida supplications as well. But before we go to the last beracha, I thought it appropriate to take some time, a couple of classes, to discuss Birkat Kohanim in a little bit more depth. We already touched on it in a prior class, a number of different elements of Birkat Kohanim. But since we finished the beracha of Hatov Shimcha Ulchana El Lehodot, typically in the Hazara of the Amida, this would be the point in which we would do Birkat Kohanim. So I thought it important to go over both the text of the beracha as well as a number of different halachot that are pertinent, as well as the significance, the prominence of this beracha. So I'm going to start with the procedural laws and way about doing Birkat Kohanim. Then we'll look at the text itself, and then maybe we'll round out talking about why Birkat Kohanim is so important, why it's important to pay such close attention to it, and to answer to the beracha properly. So first things first, the process of Birkat Kohanim doesn't actually begin here. It actually begins a few berachot ago by the beracha of Retzeh. Right? The beracha of Retzeh we called Avodah, meaning service. And we noted that the Birkat Kohanim is done in the aftermath of Avodah. But the rabbis tell us that what's very important is that the Kohanim have to do something called Akirat Raglayim. What does Akirat Raglayim mean? The Kohanim, in order to have access to the platform to do Birkat Kohanim on behalf of the people, have to get up from their place, uproot themselves, as it were, from where they're standing by the beracha of Retzeh, which basically means that they have to move their feet and motion towards the dais in order to be able to do Birkat Kohanim. It's not proper, it's not halachically permissible for a Kohen right at the last second to sort of jump up and run onto the platform and do Birkat Kohanim. Already from Retzeh, and this is already hinted to, you'll hear people shout out, Kohanim bechavod. You hear people say that out loud when we reach the beracha of Retzeh, because that's them prompting the Kohanim to rise from their seats, or to, if they're in a standing position, uproot their feet and make their way up to the platform already by this point. The rabbis say, any Kohen who does not make his way to the platform prior to the conclusion of that beracha, before Modim, is not permitted to then make Birkat Kohanim. So let's say a Kohen stepped out for a moment to go to the restroom or to take a phone call outside, and then he walks in and they're in the middle of the beracha of Modim. He may not ascend the platform and do Birkat Kohanim. He must exit the room, and he lost his opportunity to do Birkat Kohanim. So that's the first thing that has to happen. Many times Kohanim are engaged in the middle of the Chazara with washing their hands. So let's talk a little bit about the procedure of washing hands. That already begins even before the uprooting of the feet. Generally, after Kiddusha, after Nakdishach, maybe a few berachot later, the Kohanim will exit the room, or if there's a sink inside of the room, they'll go and they'll wash their hands. Why is it that Kohanim wash their hands prior to Birkat Kohanim? What's the point of this? Any takers? So it's a form of purity, maybe instead of going to the mikveh. But we did do Netilat Yadayim in the morning, right? Everybody does Netilat Yadayim in the morning before they come to prayer. So there's a couple of possibilities. One is, as Victor said, for purity, an extra level of purity, that maybe in the interim, a Kohen may have touched a certain part of his body, which contaminated his hands. So before performing this mitzvah from the Torah of Birkat Kohanim, we want the Kohanim to purify their hands by doing Netilat Yadayim. But another reason for this beracha is to mimic what was done in the Beit HaMikdash. The law in the Torah is that a Kohen is not permitted to enter the Beit HaMikdash without first washing his hands and feet. Any Kohen who enters the Mikdash and performs service without first washing his hands and feet ritually to make them pure is liable for the death penalty. Is chayav mitah bidei shamayim, and his service is null and void. So it's a very severe penalty. As the Kohen is entering into this sacred place and about to do Hashem's holy work, he must divide between his outside life and his inside life by symbolically and ritually purifying his hands through Netilat Yadayim. So to mirror what the Kohanim used to do in the Beit HaMikdash, we have Kohanim, before they do their service, which is Birkat Kohanim, wash their hands, and then they could ascend the platform. There is a halachic debate among many rabbis, namely the Rambam and the Shulchan Aruch, as to whether or not the netilat yadayim that we do in the morning is sufficient to cover this responsibility, this obligation. According to the Rambam, if a person washed his hands in the morning, netilat yadayim, and knows that he did not touch any part of his body that would contaminate his hands, there's no need to wash his hands for Birkat Kohanim. He may ascend the platform and perform the beracha without re-washing his hands. And many Syrian people have the custom not to wash their hands in the morning in Shaharit. That, however, would not apply to Musaf on Shabbat. Most poskim write that there's too much of a time gap between when a person washes his hands in the morning to when you reach Musaf, let's say, on a Shabbat or on a holiday. Generally speaking, you have the whole Shacharit plus the reading of the Torah. Generally speaking, I don't know, an hour and 20, an hour and 30 minutes since you arrived at shul. Who knows how long ago the person actually did Netilat Yadayim. You know, for me, in my experience, sometimes I'm up very early. I learn before Tefillah. So I'll be up at 6 a.m. and I'm not doing Birkat Kohanim by close to 9 o'clock. It's almost 3 hours later. Musaf, even 4 hours later. To suggest that a person did not scratch his back or this or whatever it is or touch his shoes or something like that in the 4 hour period is a hard sell for me, which is why I'm always careful, and then many others in the Bet Knesset are as well, rightfully so, to make sure that they do Netilat Yadayim before Birkat Kohanim. But by letter of the law, on a weekday, when a person just did Netilat Yadayim and 30 minutes later he's doing Birkat Kohanim and he knows he didn't touch anything, he can rely, according to the Rambam, on that washing. However, Shulchan Aruch writes that it's ideal for a person not to rely on that in any event. If he has access to water, which Baruch Hashem, with indoor plumbing and stuff like that, we have plenty of access towards, there's no reason why a person shouldn't be stringent to go ahead and to wash their hands to gain this extra mitzvah and this extra level of purity. And so that's what's recommended. If, however, there is a situation when a person would be better not to wash his hands, sometimes you're praying in a very crowded area, let's say by the house of a mourner, or if the Bet Knesset is very crowded, and people are praying the Amida, and in order to exit the room to wash their hands, you may have to cross in front of people while they're praying, which is distracting for them and is against halakha. If a person has to choose between doing Netilat Yadayim for Birkat Kohanim, which he has an opinion to rely on that he doesn't need to, versus distracting people who are in the middle of their Amida in order to exit, better to not distract them in their Amida and to just rely on that opinion than to push his way through everybody to get to wash his hands while disrupting people in their prayer.
Don't Ashkenaz, they don't do Kohanim?
We talked about this before. Yeah, the Ashkenazim outside of Eretz Yisrael predominantly do not do Birkat Kohanim on a daily basis. They do it on holidays only. And some even in Eretz Yisrael do that as well. Not Shabbat, no. And again, the Hazan reads the Beracha, but the formalized Beracha of the Kohanim is not done. So far we talked about washing our hands. Then we reach Retzeh, the Kohanim uproot themselves to go and to motion towards the platform. Now, a common conversation that people have, sometimes you see certain Kohanim will remove their shoes and stand up on the platform. Other Kohanim will keep their shoes on and stand beneath the platform. What's going on with the on, off, above, shoes on, shoes off thing? Just to summarize it, the Gemara in Masechet Sotah says that there was a rabbinic enactment to remove one's shoes for Birkat Kohanim. What was the purpose of this? Because since people were ascending the platform, they became at eye level with other people who are off the platform. In other words, when the Kohanim, our platform is very short, very small. But if you go to, let's say, Ahava Ve'ahava in Brooklyn or Sha'ar Tzion, their platforms are much higher. So when the Kohanim are on the platform, their feet are basically at eye level in many cases to the people who are off the platform, give or take, right? Which means that the people can see their shoes. So the rabbis were nervous that if a person had a shoelace that snapped, or if their shoes were muddy, right, that this would be disrespectful to the people, or they would stop to fix it, and they would miss Birkat Kohanim, right? That specifically the shoelace thing, the rabbis were nervous the person's shoelace would untie or would snap. The Kohen would go to fix it, and in the interim of fixing it, he would miss the Birkat Kohanim. What's the problem with missing Birkat Kohanim? What's the issue with a Kohen being in the room and not performing Birkat Kohanim? What will people think? People will think that he's not a real Kohen. He'll cause people to suspect his lineage. This is why if a Kohen is not going to perform Birkat Kohanim, he has to exit the room. Why does he have to exit the room? Because if people see a person with the last name Cohen or Dweck in the room not performing Birkat Kohanim, they will immediately suspect maybe there's something wrong with his lineage. they will accuse him of being what's called in halachic terms a halal. Anybody know what a halal is?
Not kosher.
A not kosher kohen. It's basically a kohen who was born from a forbidden kohen relationship. So for example, if a kohen conceives a child with a divorcee, so we know that Kohanim and divorcees by law of the Torah are not permitted to be married. Should a Kohen violate the law and live with a divorcee and conceive a child, that child, although his last name and his lineage is to his father who is a Kohen, does not receive the spiritual status of a Kohen. He's known as a halal. His Kedusha is chilul, like chilul Hashem is desecrated. So his last name will be Cohen, his last name will be Dweck, and he does not do Birkat Kohen. He has no status of a Kohen. He may not go up as Aliyat Kohen. He does not. He can go to a cemetery. He's not considered a Kohen whatsoever. So the perpetuation of Halal continues as well, down to the next one, right? So that will continue.
Wait, Rabbi, if he married a divorcee but doesn't have kids,
then the one.
Status?
Who, the one who married it?
Yeah.
So while a Kohen, if a Kohen is married to a divorcee, while he's married to her, he loses his status of his privileges of kihuna, which means he will not receive the aliyah, he will not be allowed to perform Birkat Kohanim. He still cannot go to a cemetery because by law he's a Kohen, but he abandons his Kohen privileges, basically. Because since he's done something which flagrantly violates the laws of his kihuna status, we no longer afford him all of the privileges that Kohanim get. However, as soon as he divorces this woman, he goes back to his original status of being a Kohen, despite the fact that he violated the mitzvah, the law. He did teshubah. So this is why we are constantly, if we ever find out that a Kohen is in a relationship with a divorcee, even if they're married several years, we'll continue to put pressure on them to separate from each other because every day that he's living with her and being with her is a transgression of his kihuna status. Plus, as long as he's married to her, he's no longer afforded the privileges. Should he divorce her, he goes back to being a regular Kohen. What's unfortunate is that the child, once a child is conceived, the child has a status of halal, and that status carries with him for his entire life. There's no way to remove that status.
Is there a thing where the Kohanim disfigure themselves so they can't be Kohanim and they can marry the divorcee? Something that cut their finger off or something?
It's an interesting question. By law, that wouldn't make a difference, right? I could see where somebody might think something like that.
They cut their finger like move there.
Right. So the problem with that, as far as I'm concerned, is while a mum would disqualify somebody from working in the Beit HaMikdash, that does not disqualify them from having a status of a Kohen. To my understanding, I have to double check, but a Kohen who disfigured himself would not be allowed to go to a cemetery. He's still a Kohen by all leaps and bounds. He's not, as far as my understanding. Maybe I have to take a look at it. Regardless, I don't think that's a... Possibly, but I think it's more like them... I don't... I'll double check into that, but I'm not sure that would... That's... No, it's important to understand how the laws of mumim and things like that play a role.
His shoes off because like when Moshe went to the burning bush, he took his shoes off or something like that. So it's out of respect. So that's why it makes sense that Kohanim used to take off. Let's be all out there. The Kohanim did not, when they served in the Beit HaMikdash, they served barefoot, right? For that same purpose that you're addressing, which is that they wanted to show deference to the place. So there is an idea to remove shoes to show deference, but since you're not in the Beit HaMikdash, you're just doing Birkat Kohanim, by law there isn't a requirement to have to remove your shoes, if not for that rabbinic enactment. Now, going back to that point, this is why, according to many poskim, Cham Ovadia Alav Shalom brings this down. He says, if you ascend the platform, that's when you have a problem now, because people will see the person's shoes, and that's when the issue comes. If you don't ascend the platform, so now there isn't a problem anymore, which is why many Syrians have the custom not to ascend the platform, and they leave their shoes on. My practice is, regardless of whether I ascend or not, it's appropriate to remove the shoes. So we remove, but there is what to rely on for people not to remove. You're in Israel and you're wearing sandals and you go barefoot?
One should not perform Birkat Kohanim barefoot. One should at least have socks or some kind of footwear. If not shoes, is something else on their feet when performing Birkat Kohanim. To perform barefoot is not acceptable. Yeah.
Was there
way, you're not supposed to look at the Kohanim.
Okay, good. So I'll address that point, and then we'll talk about some other things. When Birkat Kohanim is going on, there is an idea not to look at the Kohanim while they are making the beracha. So what's the reason for that? There's really two reasons that are brought down. The first of which is not applicable anymore today, but the second of which is why this halacha is still in place. The Gemara, in several places, I think it's Masechet Hagigah, says that a person who looks at the Kohanim while they are performing Birkat Kohanim, it's as if they are staring at the Shekhinah. It's as if they're staring at the divine presence. Meaning that the divine presence rests in between the fingers, the hands of the Kohanim when they're blessing the people. So to look at the hands of the Kohanim while they're blessing would be tantamount to looking at the divine presence. So the Gemara in Hagigah says one who looks at the Kohanim while they're performing Birkat Kohanim, enav kehot, his eyesight will dwindle, both like physically and spiritually, I guess, but the awesomeness of looking at that will cause harm to his eyes. They bring down a few other things, staring at the rainbow, staring at some other things also. Staring at the king out of disrespect. I don't think that's brought in that context, but there's other things that you're not supposed to stare at. You're not supposed to stare at the face of a wicked person, a lot of different things. But here it says to stare at the hands of the Kohanim while they're performing Birkat Kohanim is like staring at the divine presence, which weakens the eyes of the individual. That would not apply anymore today, because today we have the practice of covering the Kohanim with the talet. It seems as though the original Birkat Kohanim practice was not to do that. That developed a little bit later on in history. The Shulchan Aruch, I should say the Bet Yosef, Rabbi Yosef Karo, brings down that in Egypt he first saw this custom being done in around the 1500s, which means that it's relatively new comparative to a lot of practices that we have. But now that we put the talet over the head, the face and hands of the Kohanim, there isn't an issue anymore of staring from that perspective. But the rabbis bring a second reason why one should not stare at the Kohanim during Birkat Kohanim, and that's because it's distracting to the individual. When one stares at the Kohanim and is focused on the Kohanim, how the talet, this, that, it distracts them from paying attention to the beracha. And the key is that we want people only to focus on the beracha, responding to it and internalizing it. A similar halacha is brought down that a person should not look at the person blowing the shofar on Rosh Hashanah. You're looking at him, is he red? Is he going to make it? Is he blowing it good? What color is the shofar? And you're noticing all these other things which are distracting a person from internalizing the mitzvah. So to enhance kavanah, to enhance concentration during Birkat Kohanim, the rabbis outlawed staring at the Kohanim so as not so that they could have the opportunity to focus on the beracha. And that reason still applies to us today. Hence, a person should not stare at the Kohanim. They should simply put their head down and close their eyes and listen and answer Amen to the berachot. Yeah.
So you're not looking at their shoes either?
Well, nevertheless, it's true, but nevertheless, the rabbis understood while there's not allowed, it will naturally happen, right? In other words, it's natural for people to start looking at things that are there, which is why I always try to make a point. Sometimes, unfortunately, it's happened to me where I'll put on socks that maybe I didn't notice have a hole in it, like in the back or something, and then that's a problem because then you're causing people to be attracted to that. No, thankfully not. But so it's important to make sure that you're not doing anything to attract undue attention. On that note, I'll finish with this quick halacha, and then we'll close. There's a big conversation about a kohen who's disfigured. We'll go back to the disfigure. Can he perform Birkat Kohanim? Right? Let's say a kohen is missing a finger. Let's say a kohen has a type of hand discoloration, whatever it might be, some kind of mum that would attract attention. Is the kohen permitted to perform Birkat Kohanim? So the Gemara says that he's not permitted because since that will attract the attention of a person, despite the fact that you're not supposed to look, naturally the rabbis understood if a guy walks in and he's missing 2 fingers, people are going to be staring at that. So for fear of causing people to stare, a kohen who has some kind of disfigurement which will attract attention to it is not permitted to perform Birkat Kohanim. However, the rabbis mentioned 2 exceptions as to why he may be able to, which usually work in our favor. One is, this is only applicable if he's not somebody who commonly visits that minyan. Once a person is what the rabbis call dash be'iro, once people know him and are familiar with him, right? He lives there, he prays in that minyan all the time. It's not an issue anymore because people won't stare at him. They know this guy has a disfigurement. Okay, big deal, right? So once he's lived, the rabbis say, more than 30 days in that spot, he's now considered dash be'iro. Even with a disfigurement, he can go ahead and do Birkat Kohanim. That's point number one. Point number two, again, because of our practice today to place the talet over our hands and face, so people cannot see the hands and face even if they wanted to, there is no issue of them staring at the Kohen from that perspective because they won't see the disfigurement regardless. And so therefore, for both of those reasons, a Kohen who has any kind of facial disfigurement or hand or foot disfigurement is permitted to be able to perform Birkat Kohanim.
And why do we put the talit over our sons?
I don't do that.
You know?
So
My father never did it.
it's interesting. It's interesting. But what Victor is saying is very common. You do see it all over the place.
It's a new thing.
So new. Yeah. I'm not sure where it originated. We've asked this question to Rabbi Aluf many times, and I've heard it discussed by a lot of other rabbis. There is no source for such a thing whatsoever. It's not brought down anywhere in halakha. We've never found it. There isn't any source for a person bringing their child together and placing their hand on their head and maybe mimicking some kind of beracha while Birkat Kohanim is going on. In fact, some rabbis have spoken out against the practice. They said that the practice could be problematic because what you're doing at that moment is you're almost undermining the beracha of the Kohanim. You're supposed to be focusing on the beracha that's coming from the Kohanim, and a person may be giving the false impression that the beracha is coming from the father by blessing their child or holding their child next to them at that time period, right? So, A, there's no source for it. B, according to some rabbis, they've even said that a person should actively avoid such a practice.
Jack, you never saw when you were a kid, right? We didn't do that.
Rabbi, how come not some of the like the rabbis like on Saturday make a speech in shul about it? Like, right, hey, please do not.
Yeah, so
Some people don't.
I never heard any
I heard the
rabbis.
Egyptians do it.
Oh, they do.
they do it. So I think the reason why I don't actively say anything is A, there's a very important rabbinic adage which is called pick your battles, right? So when I sit up at night and list the things that I want to talk to my people about and try to improve them, this doesn't make it anywhere near my top 10, right? In the end of the day, if a father wants to sit there and hold his child's hand while they're receiving Birkat Kohanim, it's a nice thing. Okay, I understand. It's not something that typically was done. I wouldn't recommend it. If someone says, Rabbi, should I do it? I'd tell them, no, there's no reason to do it if you don't need to. But it's not something that I'm necessarily, actively fighting necessarily. Yeah.
It's longer than that.
No, I never saw it.
No, I remember about a year ago, I forgot what shul I was in, and my father-in-law wanted to put a talit on my head, so I told him no, and he got all upset at me. I don't do anything.
Right. I don't think it's worth making like a fight or thing. You're a little old to have your father putting the head on still. People do it with like unmarried children and stuff like that. But it should be made clear that the father is not supplementing the beracha of the Kohanim, which that could be problematic. Yeah, I guess so. There's a feeling of father, son, beracha. Like there's always that connection. So, okay, it is what it is.
What about people opening their hands like this? Some people stand there with their hands open.
I mean, if some kind of a hand motion or gesture helps a person to have kavanah because like they're opening their hands to receive the beracha, I don't see anything wrong with that. There isn't anything that I've seen written about it necessarily. So it's not a mandatory type thing. Okay. I mean, look, sometimes customs develop, they kind of pop out of nowhere, and once they become part of common activity, they become, that's how they make their way in, right? So that's what I would say about that. We'll talk more about some of the halachot and procedural aspects of Birkat Kohanim in coming classes. Baruch Adonai Le'olam, amen ve'amen.